I'm Thomas Malone from MIT. I'm the Master of Ceremonies for our panel today on environment, governance, and action. One of the things we want to focus on in this panel is the phenomenon of global climate change and what we should do about it. Now, as many of you know, global climate change is certainly a very complex, big problem. Some people would say the most complex, or at least one of the biggest problems we face as a species today. It affects or may affect all of us. All of our actions affect it. It involves some very incompletely understood scientific issues about phenomena that are very difficult to predict precisely. And it may require a kind of coordination among countries around the world and various sectors of society within each country on a scale that has perhaps never been achieved before. So the question we'd like to tackle in our panel today is, what should we as a species do about this problem? What should governments do? What should the private sector do? And what can individuals do in their own personal behavior and in any kind of political action?
That. As a venture capitalist that funds a lot of clean tech companies, I'm constantly battling the young creative minds. Or do they go to Facebook or do they go to Tesla? I mean, there is a war for talent. And so the importance of policy in terms of my work is in getting those people to believe that there's a future for them in anything but digital media and moving over into clean tech. And that's a very important role that policy plays. The consistency, the predictability of prices on carbon or renewable portfolio standards or rebates for solar, the whole package that we see. So I would like to make a call for policies that have some predictability, because that's where investment dollars will flow. It's very hard to invest if things are changing every few years. But also not to worry as much, because we're getting at grid parity in some regions of the world. Electricity prices are often going up, and it's much easier for renewables to compete. And there's a groundswell of consumer interest in these products. So I have several portfolio companies that don't require regulation, but are moving because of consumer demand. And that comes from education, it comes from advocacy. And so what I would like to see is that the investment resources of nations, of pension funds, of foundations really allocate some capital and growing amounts of capital to this long-term investment, because I think that the returns are starting to come in. People have made lots of money in companies like a Tesla, just like they made lots of money at Google. And that's always a good thing, and people will use that as a role model. But it's obviously, it's creating jobs, and it's creating products that consumers want to have. But without that long-term investment approach on the part of the chief investment officers of a range of financial institutions, public and private, you're not going to see us move the needle. And so I think that creative approaches to setting aside investment dollars for this are crucial.
Okay, great.
Okay. I'll confine my position statement to some technologies that are here and now, and offer some observations and some suggestions about how we can mobilize them in the near future. First, it's not a question of capital. There's plenty of money and capital that will chase profitable transactions. I would agree with Nancy that it's predictability in the build-out of wind and solar photovoltaic, which are the two promising existing transactions that have been missing. I mean, if you look in Europe, which was most successful in the wind and solar build-out, you had in Germany, for example, which is still the world's leader, guaranteed feed-in tariffs, which offer certainty of investment that allow investors to make the capital investments that are required. Look at the opposite, where Spain had generous subsidies, changed the subsidies, and then the changes were retroactive, so that investors made decisions contemplating long-term subsidies, which were altered in time. I think it's hugely disruptive. And if you take a thing like offshore wind, where the supply chain requires massive capital investment for heavy lift cranes, for specialized vessels, for developments of the turbines and the towers. You know, if we take in the UK the renewable obligation certificate scheme, which is extremely complex and uncertain, it hasn't allowed the kind of vertical integration that a company, with a couple of exceptions of Centrica and Vattenfall, to make the investments that were required to mobilize the long, windy coastline of the UK. The conditions are perfect for maybe taking renewables up, offshore wind to 7% of the UK power generation. And to me, it would be very easy. Well, let me get to my point. If you had, say, for solar, 25 US cents guaranteed feed-in tariff per kilowatt hour for 20 years for any installation this year, and maybe had the tariff go down by 3 or 4% every year to address technological developments and declining costs and externalities that are generated from the early production. And then for wind, let's say 6 to 9 cents with adjustments depending on how windy the site is. That would last for 20 years. For onshore wind, double that for offshore wind. And I think I think we would see a huge response without a heavy cost to society. So that's my proposal. Do those 3 things. And root it in law, as is done in Germany, so that investors don't worry that the rules will change once they make the capital investment.
In order to talk about what we should do, perhaps it's worthwhile to first look at what hasn't worked. And I think there's 2 things that we can fairly well conclude after having had this discussion for 20 years. One is we're not going to get a global deal. We saw that in Copenhagen. I mean, it's nice to have that idea, and it's been a goal for a very long time, but fundamentally, we're not going to get a lot of countries, especially 192 countries, to decide on doing stuff that is essentially costly to themselves and will only benefit far off future, mostly other places. And I think we need to get away from that concept. It's, in many ways, it's drained away much of our attention to what will succeed by focusing so unilaterally on a scheme that's clearly not working. If you will, we've spent 20 years and we've managed to cut at very, very generously 0.5 percentage point of our emissions. And of course, what we're talking about is that we need to cut in the order of 50, maybe 80%. And that's below 1990 levels, so that would be even more in percentage points. The second part is to realize that the technology is not there economically. Now, a lot of people will like to tell you that the technology is there in the sense that we could power the world with green energy. That's true, but it's a little bit true in the same way that we could, we have the technology to bring everybody to the moon. In principle, we can do it. It would just turn out to be incredibly costly. And that's, of course, why a lot of this conversation ends up circling around, well, we need subsidies for this, we need subsidies for that. And what happens, unfortunately, is we end up spending lots of money, getting very little except for symbolic acts. Germany is a good example. Germany is getting about 1% of its energy from solar panels, yet the net effect by the end of the century, by having spent about $75 billion, will be to postpone global warming by about 7 hours at the end of the century. So we got to ask ourselves, is that really what we want? Just have the solar panels on our rooftops, feel good about it, but not actually having done anything. And that's why I think the right way forward has to be to focus on getting technology to be cheaper. In that sense, I definitely agree with Nancy. This is about getting the technologies that will power the future, not by subsidizing them now, because fundamentally we cannot afford to subsidize it except for when it's very small, which is what a little bit Germany found out, certainly what Spain found out. You can subsidize it when very few have it. You can't afford it when everybody gets it. That's why we need to focus a lot more on research and development in technology, because if we could bring the price down, if we could get solar panels to be cheaper than fossil fuels, we'd solve the problem. So it's not so much about getting lots of subsidies to inefficient solar panels now as it is to get research to solar panels so that they will become sufficiently cheap that everyone, not just rich, well-meaning Westerners, but everyone will buy them. Of course, this is not just solar panels, this is windmills and all the other things, and it's all the technologies that we don't even know whether will work, second-generation biofuels, obviously power saving. There are lots of other technologies. I love the idea of being able to grow your own oil fields with the algae offshore. I don't know whether it works. It doesn't work economically now, but those are the amazing amount of great ideas that I think we should be funding, but funding the research. And that's about getting all those bright minds to do the things that will actually solve this problem in the long-term future.
Great.
Yeah, great selection of ideas and input here. We're very close on many technologies, but not all technologies. And I think we have to step back and realize that there are actions that can be taken at multiple different levels. And one of the principal ones that I think about is the interplay among different technologies in order to make a much more efficient system and to provide energy services in a sustainable, climate-friendly way. Classic example here would be the very inefficient system that we've inherited for the last 40 or 50 years of our electricity distribution system, our generation distribution system. And on average, a coal plant, which Carl has worked so hard on, is only roughly 30% efficient at the burning point, and then you've got transmission and distribution losses as they go forward. It's an incredibly inefficient system, and so to step back and look among technologies for efficiencies in order to more properly steward the resources and use the resources effectively, I think is very important. That, along with efficiency, continues to be the lowest hanging fruit in terms of where we can go in terms of addressing energy demand in order to need less primary energy going into it. And in order to achieve that, coming back to maybe one of the questions, and we can pop down this pathway in the future, is really how do we get there? I think I'll agree with Bjorn that a top-down approach that we've struggled with or for the last 20 years really hasn't delivered much. But we see now a very viable discourse at the local or regional or national level, depending upon where. And there are many drivers that can be addressed by using the proper energy solutions and bringing them forward. And so that's everything from local environment to water, to food, to jobs, to contributions to the greenhouse gas reductions, as well as adaptation resiliency going forward, understanding what will be changing. And we can talk about that as we go forward. So I'll stop there.
Great.
I want to pull back for a second. And we need to remember that there are a couple of things that are true about this century that weren't true about the last century. We have 7 billion people, and we're headed towards probably 9. And 4 or 5 billion of them live in societies that have mastered the trick of sustained economic growth. So we've got not only more people, but exponentially more consumers. And the problem we're going to face as a consequence of that is there isn't any North America to harvest. There isn't even any great cod fishery in the North Atlantic to harvest. These 4 or 5 billion new consumers who are going to be added over the course of this century are going to be tapping into the same natural resource base which only 50 years ago was sustaining perhaps 1.5 billion consumers. We should worry about peak oil, but we should more fundamentally recognize that we're running up against peak stuff. There just are not enough natural resources to equip 7 billion people with the kind of resource-intense prosperity that characterizes North America, Europe, and Japan. Look at the price of copper for a moment. We've done enormous substitutions for copper. We don't string very many telephone wires into people's houses, and most of our electricity is no longer carried on copper wires. North America, Japan, and Europe are all in economic doldrums at best. In spite of that fact, copper is more expensive than it's ever been in history. The reality is that the fossil solutions that we've been told we can rely on are simply not going to be available even if we don't worry about the climate. And the exception, of course, everybody knows that oil is getting more and more expensive. Everybody's been told coal is cheap and abundant. Geologically, coal is abundant. And there is some coal which is very, very cheap. If you dig coal out of a coal seam on the surface in Mongolia and burn it in a power plant 5 miles away, that's very cheap coal. But the reality is, cheap coal is not abundant. And what's happened in Asian energy markets this summer is staggering. Price of coal has reached levels that have caused China and India to basically shut down half of their coal-fired generating capacity in spite of the fact that they're desperately short of power because they cannot afford the prices that coal exporting countries are now able to command in today's marketplace. When the China and India set out about a decade ago to build an enormous fleet of coal-fired generation, and they did so on the premise that the electricity that would result would be priced somewhere between 2.5 and 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour. We now know that by the time those plants come online, that power is going to cost something like 9 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour. We also know that in China, with the feed-in tariff of 7.5 cents, there is enormous business interest in building wind. And at a feed-in tariff of 15 cents, there's enormous business interest in building solar. So in fact, a basket of wind and solar is actually, right now, pretty competitive with the future cost of coal. But the key thing we need to recognize is there is a technological barrier. Bjorn is right. There is an economic barrier in the sense of the price of capital, not so much its raw availability. There is a lot, but it's pretty expensive. And new technological solutions tend to be capital intensive. Wind and solar are both very capital intensive. But the third factor, which gets too little attention, is energy markets, and markets more broadly, were designed in an era in which natural resources were abundant, information was scarce, and pollution was a minor problem, or seen as a minor problem. The result is we have a whole host of barriers within energy markets that prevent us from moving forward into a world in which we get 100 times as much value from every increment of natural resources that we use. I'll give you an example from the state of Texas. This summer in Texas, as a result of the heat wave, as a result of the fact that in very hot conditions, much of Texas's electrical fleet couldn't be operated, it was shut down by the heat. On the hottest day this summer, the Texas grid system paid $3,250 for a kilowatt hour of electricity at 4:30 in the afternoon. The customer who used that very, very pricey kilowatt hour paid the same 11 cents that they would have paid to use a kilowatt hour in the middle of the night when actually Texas, on a windy day when Texas has more wind power than it has demand. They actually have to dump electricity because they have too much wind. So the fact that we have energy markets in which people pay the same amount for what is essentially a free kilowatt hour of electricity and a $3,000 kilowatt hour of electricity tells us that if we got our market structures right so they encouraged people to use resources efficiently, we would unleash an enormous amount of both savings and innovation in a way that would actually be economically quite lucrative. So I would say we ought to get markets right and not assume that the markets we have today are some kind of economic model, because they're not.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Let me take the point of view of the urbanization process and how that relates to the energy. We are seeing that 50% of the world population now lives in cities, and this tendency is in a human history peak rate. Let's say that today we are assisting to the fastest urbanization process in human history. More people go to the city than ever in the past in human history. And of course, what happens when people go to the city is that they use more energy. They tend to consume more energy, and they tend to demand more energy in the city. And when you look at why people is moving to the cities, you can think a lot of romantic ideas in order to keep the people stuck in the rural areas, but people are going to the cities because, in a city, a chap or a person who comes from a village, in 1 week in the city learns more about life that in half of the time that he spent on the village. I am talking about Africa, Asia, these kind of places. Then the reason why people go to the city is because the city is a huge engine of productivity. It's a huge hub of information. It's a huge hub of energy. And people is even ready to live in worse condition, but to stay in an information hub. They are ready to sacrifice some issues in order to be in the hot spot at the city, even living in slums and surrounded by mafia. This is better than to stay in a poor rural setting with the local traditions, which doesn't bring much expectation of a better life in the future. And this is why people go to the cities. And this is going to accelerate because now with fast communications, people is more aware of the difference that there's between the rural situation and the urban situation. And if that is going to stay, people is going to demand more and more and more urbanization. And in that sense, this is going to demand more energy. And that would be an additional factor of increased demand for energy. And I'm totally agree with the last person who has interviewed in the sense that we need to put prices to the energy because we have been used to a century, that's the 20th century, including the little part of the 19th century, which also we were consuming already some energy, that we have been consuming the energy at extremely low prices. Think on what you pay for your electricity bill today that allows you to have light during the night, heating and refrigeration. You know what you pay per day? You know your bill? The cost of having night light, you know what do you pay in average for having the possibility to read a book at 10 in the night and to see the TV and to charge your iPhone? You probably pay the cost of one coffee or perhaps 2 coffees a day. Do you think that the value of one coffee or 2 coffee a day, it's the same value of having light during the night? And on top of that, paying the bill of electricity, you pay probably 60% of that in taxes. Okay? Then I agree that the market, that the energy, it has been a very cheap commodity in the 20th century. And the question is that in the 21st century, probably this is not going to be so, because most of the energy solutions for the 21st century are becoming expensive than the ones of the 20th. Even nuclear energy that has been sold as the cheapest or one of the cheapest energy, if we interiorize in the price all the costs of nuclear energy with the required level of safety, that probably will jump from the nowadays cost of nuclear, which is 2 or 3 cents per kilowatt, to 6, 7, or 8 cents per kilowatt. In fact, the last nuclear stations that are being built at a higher level of security, level 3, for example, they are still coming. They are already coming at that cost of 6, 7, 8, 9 cents per kilowatt. The market nowadays, the overall market of energy around the world is probably about 3, 4, 5 cents. If we add to that taxes, you go to double taxes, 6, 7, 8 cents. And if you look at the bill that you pay in your home, probably it's 11, 12, 13 cents. That it's other subsidies and things that they are placed in the bill. Of course, this is not sustainable, because we are using by now in the electricity generation, let's say 60% or more than 60% is fossil fuel. And this is, this is going to be very much expensive, and still we know that today it's quite cheap. Then I think that the crisis is not as big as we think, in the sense that probably alternative energies will come priceable on reach quite soon, and that people is going to be willing to pay much more than what they are paying today in order to have light in the night and heating and refrigeration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You have a burning comment?
Yeah, I do.
Yes.
I do. I'd like to disagree with what Bjorn said, if it's okay to do that here, and to invoke the insight of Professor Phelps, who won the prestigious Blouin Award last night. How does innovation take place? It doesn't, all the evidence shows it doesn't come from the laboratory. Gutenberg didn't invent the printing press. The printing came from hundreds of innovations, from trial and error and learning by doing, and consumers learning to accept the product, and bindings and glues and materials. And Edison didn't invent the light bulb, or no one invented the car or the television. It all comes, or even the modern wind turbine. It comes from customers trying new things, from the supply chain learning to react. It comes every day from successes and failures, and people like Nancy trying out things, most of which don't work, but sometimes they do. And when you say, we can subsidize this and subsidize that, yeah, if we don't try things out in the marketplace, we're going to be stuck in laboratory experiments for generations. And the eureka moment will probably never come, because history shows that's not where it comes from. So, yes, solar in Germany is a minor contribution. Wind is not. And all this technology, none of which is is a conglomeration of many different details that all came from people trying things out in the world.
Absolutely. I mean, it definitely requires a lot of people trying out a lot of stuff. The discussion from an economic point of view is, if you take windmills, Denmark put up, I come from Denmark, we put up a lot of windmills in the 70s, 80s, 90s. We felt incredibly proud about them. About 10,000 windmills in all. We've cut down all of them because they're incredibly inefficient. We've replaced them with more efficient, still not efficient, but more efficient ones. So the real question is, should we put up 10,000 of them? There is no doubt that you need to put up one. There is no doubt that putting up 10,000, and we have the Economic Council's word for that, was a failure in the sense that we spent way too much money and got too little out of it. So the question is, how do you place yourself somewhere in between? If you could just allow me a brief metaphor, and I think it is important because this is really how we get to a point where we will solve global warming. If you look at computers, computers in the 1950s, getting them better was not about buying lots and lots of them. It was not to subsidize them so every American would have a computer in 1960. Yes, that would have gotten faster vacuum tubes, but it wouldn't actually have solved the problem. It would have been a horrendous misuse of funding. What we should do was buy a few, which was what the military did, and spend lots of money on research so that we could get better transistors, we could get better storage, we could get all the things that eventually made it possible for Apple and IBM to make computers that people want to buy. So the real question is, should we buy lots of inefficient ones and focus fairly little on research, or the other way around? And I'm making that argument.
Yeah, where I would contest your analogy is where, society, there are no externalities from when I buy a computer. It doesn't have the same social impact as when I reduce my carbon output. So society is in a rush to bring about the adoption of new technologies. And, looking back on it, was the subsidy too high in Denmark? Nobody really knows the counterfactual. How many things were stimulated by putting up these windmills? Nobody knows. And does Germany have too many right now? How many resources were dedicated to the construction of the modern turbine, which is so much more impressive than it was?
Carl wants to
Nobody knows.
Let me,
Carl and then Nancy.
yeah,
Carl and then Nancy.
first of all, we have a lot of, it's not just like one marketplace out there where there's one price. There are an enormous number of places where right now a photovoltaic cell is cheaper than the source of electricity which is being used, because photovoltaic cells have this wonderful feature. They generate most electricity when there's the most sunshine, which is when the load is greatest and when many of the other sources get shut down. Off-grid in India, people burn kerosene. Photovoltaics are clearly cheaper, 10 times cheaper, lumen for lumen, than kerosene. And the kerosene is enormously subsidized by the government of India. We have huge opportunities to intelligently deploy these new things at massive scale. We also have the opportunity to do it stupidly. But stupidity is always optional. We can always stop being stupid and be smarter. But I think the idea that it's either all going to happen in a laboratory or it's all going to happen by setting one price on carbon are both gross oversimplifications of a complicated, totally screwed up market, which we should stop being stupid about.
Okay, Nancy and then Bjorn.
Well, I just want to say two things. One, I think we're guilty of Monday morning quarterbacking and calling, windmills inefficient. I mean, I can assure you that Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs sold as many computers as they possibly could when Apple was started, and they were horrible in retrospect. Of course, we would not use an Apple Lisa today any more than we would use kerosene to light our homes. So, but the point is that the early adopters bought the product, just like the early adopters bought the big old cell phones that cost a lot and were horrible to use. And that created revenue to then fund the next generation and provide a path to something that we all now acknowledge as being useful. We're just in the infancy of that in renewable energy. I mean, the fact that we don't even have storage, which we're going to have in the next 5 years, which will take care of that silly problem about not being able to use your renewable energy at night. That's going to be solved. We haven't solved it yet, but it takes investment, it takes R&D, it takes putting up with things that are not as necessarily as efficient in the early days. That's what the marketplace does, and my second point is that the subsidies issue is real. I mean, if you look, we just did a study of nuclear and oil subsidies in the United States in the first 15 years of their lives in the early part of the century for oil and the mid-century for nuclear. Nuclear was subsidized 10 times more than renewables are in their first 15 years, and oil was subsidized 5 times more. So this notion that we haven't subsidized every single energy transition is false. So what we need to do is leverage the fact that we are subsidizing, harness the market forces, and put up with inefficiency. That's what we all thrive on, and that's how we've seen other industries be able to address growing needs on many, many levels. So let's not be Monday morning quarterbacks and call things inefficient, when in reality there were a big advance over what we used before, and early users of the Apple product would certainly remember and testify to that.
So we're almost out of time, but we have time for quick comments from Bjorn and Doug, and then if Joan has a very quick comment after that.
Could I, because this is an incredibly interesting conversation, but clearly we don't have time, but can I just at least make 3 points that I think the panel perhaps could agree on? I think Carl's point of saying that we need energy markets to work better, I think the whole panel would agree, and that there are huge opportunities to be gained there. I think Nancy's point on innovation is very well taken, that is really one of the ways that we need to especially make sure that young talent get into not just Facebook, but actually making solutions that will also fix global warming. And I would hope that we would also agree that at least funding to research and development of green energy would be a great way to focus on finding parts of the solution.
Okay, great. Doug?
Yeah. 2 quick points, really. The first is that while renewables today feel as though they're relatively young, because they are relative to the other technologies, last year they actually provided almost 50% of all new growth in electric power globally. There were about $250 billion worth of investments in renewables. So they're real markets, as Carl mentioned, a couple of examples where they're very, very viable today. And so I don't think we should walk away with the impression that these technologies and the companies are in the experimental phase. There are many billions out there. That's the first. The last is, I'd like to suggest another element where perhaps we could agree, which kind of bodes well to our host and to the theme, I think, of the summit, really, is around the need for public discourse. And not top-down discourse, but really much more bottoms-up discourse that is well-informed by credible, objective data and information, and that people become aware of the value of the energy rather than just the price, and to really build a consciousness and awareness so that there can be an informed dialogue and, I think, a collective decision that actually is driven from the bottom up rather than top down.
Let me just respond very quickly to that. As some of you know, we have a project at MIT called the Climate Collab, trying to do exactly what you said, to facilitate using the worldwide internet and the kind of approach to global collective intelligence that we've seen in Wikipedia and other places to facilitate the kind of bottom-up as well as top-down dialogue about these issues. So do the other 2 panelists have any final comments before we close? Either of you?
Samo mali komentar. Ja mislim da smo danas čuli dosta interesantne predloge i da se ovom problemu mora pristupati sa nacionalnog, regionalnog I globalnog nivoa.
Yes, we've heard lots of interesting ideas and solutions today. I believe that we need to approach these issues at national, regional and global level.
Ukoliko se ovom problemu pristupi isključivo sa biznis strane, bojim se da ćemo ponovo doći do ekološke neravnoteže.
I'm afraid that if we approach these issues only from the point of view of the business community, I'm afraid that we'll find ourselves in environmental imbalances as well.
Ali da susretne strategije nacionalne, regionalne i globalne moraju da prvo daju odgovor da li dobro prepoznajemo globalne ekološke izazove.
How I believe that all strategies, be it local, regional and global, must respond to the following question. Do we really recognize what is out there? What are the challenges?
I da li imamo globalno obrazovanje i istraživanje koje može da pratite odgovor na te izazove.
And whether we have a global education and research that can respond to these issues.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Any closing comments? Very, very quick.
No, I agree with what it has been said, especially about the issue of careful with the subsidies, because they affect the transparency and the correct signals of the price in this market. I think that an advance on the clarity of the price, it would be very favorable for the sector, because now a lot of things are hidden under subsidies, under taxation, and at the end, I don't know, the behavior of the people is not affected by the real cost of the energy. I remember my grandmother who was going through my house just closing down the lights. We have lost these why? Because it's so cheap, the energy, that nobody cares about saving energy. And this is something that it must be corrected quite soon. And also I agree, because I've been Minister of Energy in Spain, also that the renewables, at least in the case of electricity, are already something quite mature, and of course there's a huge way to advance, but they already represent quite a big share of the energy pool.
Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize what I think I heard as the points of consensus on the panel, and then I'm going to ask you to take a vote as to whether you believe the panelists have done enough work so that they can be let off the stage.
Yeah.
So I heard 4 things that I believe that they all agreed on. One is that we should have more efficient or more intelligent markets for energy. Second is that we should invest more in research, what you might think of as almost fundamental research, to develop these technologies to a better place. Third is that we should have what you might call innovation or early entrepreneurial development of these technologies, not just in the laboratory, but in the actual market. And fourth is that we should have more bottom-up public discussion about these issues. So the question is, how many of you believe that they've done enough work to get off the panel? Please raise your hand. Okay. Thank you very much.